Okay, the second lecture for today will be by Tomislav Medak. Tomislav is experienced activist in the fields of technology, post-capitalism, also theory. Maybe today it will not be so much in the focus, but he is also an artist and a member of theater collective Bad Company. But I don't know, maybe he will surprise us. But today lecture will be basically some continuation of what we heard before from Jagoda. Basically, what is the impact or role of technology in this so very often mentioned transition to more sustainable and just society. So, Tomislav, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Šimleša. Thank you for the invitation to present here. Though today I won't speak so much about transition. I asked Jagoda before coming here what should I present on, and she suggested I should talk about geoengineering or climate engineering, and that will be my particular focus for today, though my general interest is in how we can change the course, the trajectory of technological development, not only working from within the technological arena, but also from without. So I guess some of these things will be articulated here. I also have to apologize. In a way, I didn't expect I should present today, and I just came from another conference, so I had to put it quickly together. I'll be reading, though I usually tend to read because I don't feel secure enough to improvise. So if I'm going too fast, or if it's too complicated, or if I'm too quiet, just remind me. Okay.
You can also come closer, because you don't need to.
No, that's fine. I can speak loud. Don't worry. Okay. Technosphere was already mentioned here earlier, so a bit about that. There are three assumptions that come together in technological determinism. First, the assumption that technological development proceeds largely autonomously from the social, economic, or political factors, following primarily considerations of technological efficiency and social functionality, or the genius of engineers and in the ingenuity of their solutions. Second, the assumption that technological development is a linear succession of successful technological innovations that have transformative social effects. Third, the assumption that technological change conditions and drives social change, that it changes social institutions. Historically, technological determinism is correlative to the spirit of innovations that have driven the immense expansion of industrial capitalism since the 19th century. The rise of a hegemonic capitalist system of production premised on competitive gains from the advances in technological innovation, and the separation of the technoscientific process from the immediate process of production. All of these processes start and develop in the 19th century and birth something that I have last time around here at the Degrowth Conference coined as techno-developmentalism. Regardless of the tendency of social theory to dispatch with the technological determinism nonetheless reflects a hegemonic common sense resulting from the fact that most of the world inhabits intensely technological environments. It is for the reason of ubiquity and preponderance of technological systems that technological determinism shapes motivations and expectations of technologists, investors, governments, and the public. And as Sally Wyatt has suggested, it has to be acknowledged that it's effective, at least at the justificational, descriptive, and normative level. But beyond that hegemonic common sense, there are also some non-subjective factors that we should nonetheless consider before we declare determinism fully inadequate. Namely, as the large-scale technological systems such as resource extraction, agriculture, manufacture, infrastructure, transport expands and become integrated with the equally expanding social metabolic processes, they place ever greater constraints on the social shaping or changing of these large-scale technological systems. This is the effect of a lock-in, or with technical terms, path dependency. Yet, and this is my principal proposition, the greater the lock-in, the greater the effect that contestation and disruption can have in changing these systems. Now, a shameless promotional plug here. There is a book just by, that came out in translation by Institut for Political Ecology. It's a historical book written by a Swedish human anthropologist, Andreas Malm, on the origins of fossil economy. So, while there are biophysical, I'll say a little bit about it, this book and how it fits into what I'm saying here. Well, there are biophysical and technical constraints in technology. So technological lock-ins are still mostly of social making. So I'm not saying that technologies are socially constructed simply. There are technical and biophysical limitations to technical systems. Technological lock-ins are still mostly of social making, paths chosen in the historical development. Take, for instance, the rise of fossil capitalism. Andreas Malm, in his Fossil Capital, an extraordinary and intricate account of the origins of fossil capitalism in the 19th century industrial Britain, is able to show that there was no actual bottleneck in the use of water energy. Hey, hello. And that the rise of coal as the dominant source of energy can neither be attributed to technological advances, so James Watt's steam engine, nor specifically to properties of coal as fuel. He argues that the cycle of self-perpetuating and compounding growth emerged in the cotton mills. Yet, at the end of the 18th century, the primary source of energy in that industry was water, which remained more abundant, underutilized, efficient, and cheap well after coal finally did become the dominant source of energy in cotton mills around 1835, almost 50 years after Watt's invention. So, why did coal prevail over water, if not for the superiority of coal as energy source and the steam engine as a motive power? Malm attributes the transition of capitalist production to fossil fuels to a confluence of three major factors. Most prominently, as a consequence of the integrated factory production system, an organized labor movement emerges. This leads to the repeal of the combination laws in 1824, the Factory Act of 1833, the Chartist General Strike of 1842, and the 10-Hour Act of 1847. These struggles and gains, however, left the water-powered capital, which was mostly situated in the countryside, in an inferior position to the fossil-powered capital in towns that could draw on a large reserve army of labor. So it had less constraints resulting from these changes, mostly in law. The growing power of organized labor to make demands and limit exploitation thus have made coal a better proposition for the capitalist. This is the dialectic. It was only once this trajectory of militancy was set on course that the benefits of coal kicked in. Coal's spatiotemporal profile, so Malm, thus enabled capitalists to employ labor wherever and whenever it best suited their interests. This reliability and pliability allowed capitalists to deploy machinery and automation to discipline and subsume workers into an organization of production that was fully opposite to the needs of capital. It was organized to the needs of capital. Thus, it was social relations of production, the experience of exploitation, class struggle, property law, property relations, and law, and not a technological innovation or the superiority of an energy source that triggered the transition to fossil-fueled capitalism. Technological change is downstream from social change. But this is not the full story, as I already indicated. The lock-in into fossil fuel technologies in the present plays itself out on climate change. This summer has marked 30 years since the climatologist James E. Hansen warned the US decision makers that the rising global temperatures are the likely, if not sure, effect of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Yet since that 1988, the continued use of fossil fuels has put out as much CO2 emissions into the atmosphere as it did between 1750 and 1988. The world's yearly CO2 emissions have almost doubled, and the global temperature now stands over 1 degree centigrade above the pre-industrial average. Fossil fuel technologies, with their sheer scale and centrality in the capitalist technologically advanced societies, seems to pose important limitations on the extent and urgency of climate action. Due to disregard of earlier warnings, the time window for climate action that will keep the global warming by 22nd century under 1.5 degrees centigrade or 2 degrees centigrades is becoming sort of the time window is shorter and shorter. This is a graph from the authoritative BP's yearly energy outlook, and it projects therefore it needs to be understood not merely as descriptive, but it's also performative. It tells us something also about what an important segment of actors in this field, big oil, are seeing as their future and their source of stability. Fossil fuels will remain dominant in the world's total primary energy supply well into the second part of the 20th century. Here are projections until 2040. It is the action or the inaction that will decide whether capitalist technologically advanced societies will continue burning those fossil fuels at the present rate, leading to a dangerous climate change or extreme climate change with the global warming reaching 3.2 or 4.8, whether we'll expediently divest from fossil fuel technology and do what is necessary to stop emitting greenhouse gases, to stabilize the global climate, planetary climate, in a mere matter of decades, or whether we'll resort to climate engineering solutions, such as solar radiation management, to limit that global warming. And this is the ultimate technological fix and lock-in that I'll spend most of my discussion here on. But energy systems are large. Consider the macro scale of the technosphere powered by those fossil fuel energy systems. The last 2 centuries of industrial capitalist development have spawned an enormous technological base that includes built environment, manufacture, transportation, agriculture, livestock husbandry, service, and communication systems. Somebody earlier has mentioned that Technosphere is larger than planetary biosphere, and that is the fact. To account for that scale and attain quality of that aggregate technological base, the geologist Peter K. Huff has proposed that we decenter our anthropocentric view and that we analyze the technosphere as an autonomous geological paradigm comparable to Earth's atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere, or biosphere, and that we consider it as a geological paradigm on whose sustained functioning human societies depend for their sustenance and reproduction. While the technosphere already draws on substantial resources of other geological paradigms, appropriating, for instance, over 10% of their energy flux, with a switch to much more plentiful solar renewable sources, it might grow substantially larger still, taking humans along the developmental path for as long as it doesn't hit the limit of other planetary resources it requires for this expansion, primarily in the case of technosphere remaining constrained to planet Earth. For as long as it doesn't hit the limit of other resources it requires for expansion, primarily because of the failure to develop ways to recycle the reserves already in use. The important point Huff wants to make with his invitation to displace our perspective is that given the human dependence on large-scale technological infrastructures and their constant dependency on high-rate metabolism of energy, throughput of energy and matter, the technosphere might not leave much strategic leeway to human-centered and nature-centered policy initiatives. Shortly, we are doomed. Human-built technology is so big and built around self-sustaining social mechanisms that it locks humans into a path of technological development that doesn't allow for large-scale shifts in its direction, scale, and dependency on resources. The planetary technosphere, powered by fossil fuels, thus constrains the space of political decisions and social agency. So I want to grapple with this fact in my remaining talk. So focusing on climate engineering specifically. As will probably be repeated many times over the next couple of days, the world stands in anticipation as the IPCC's sixth assessment report is to be unveiled in September. It is expected to project that the global warming is firmly on course to surpass 1.5 degrees increase that was sort of negotiated under Paris Agreement. The confluence of climate-related ravages this summer has made it patently clear that dangerous climate change is no longer a distant future ahead of us, but an imminent present. Yet, as this climate action tracker, it's an organization website that tracks basically policies of individual signees to the Paris Agreement and calculates what is our present course, where are we headed, how much temperature rise we can expect by the end of the century. The current nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement are consistent with a 3.2 degrees rise, and actual policies are consistent with a 3.4 degrees temperature rise. Technological systems are at the center of climate change mitigation strategies. Decarbonization of production and consumption primarily hinges on the efficiency gains in technological systems. So how much will make our technological systems more efficient? So to have less to substitute by renewable energies, and then the substitution of non-renewable fossil fuel sources with renewable sources. Yet in spite of the urgency, that transition is unfolding slow. Unlike the advances in microcomputing, which these days set the expectations from any process of technological change, so we expect that everything will develop exponentially according to Moore's law, though it does no longer hold even in microcomputing. The innovation and deployment of renewables so far has been a much more linear process of gradual advances. We still stand below 5% of total energy, primary energy supply from renewables, and will probably continue to stay there. The larger an energy system the harder it is to replace. Earlier in the 20th century, the replacement of coal as the dominant source of energy by oil was easier. The total consumption of energy was much smaller. Today, where oil dominates, it's a much larger system that needs replacing. The innovation and deployment of renewables so far has been a much more linear process of gradual advances. Also, there are technological, biophysical, and environmental limitations to the upscaling of renewable sources such as wind, waves, or biomass. We can't expand them as much as we would wish. There's just limited availability of those, and they contend with other uses for those resources. And no less, the inertia of sunken cost in an existing energy system, the reliability of that system, and the problems of intermittence of renewable sources of energy present a further set of obstacles. So it is no surprise that, as famously Kevin Anderson and Glenn Peters have argued in their 2016 Science Opinion piece, from which this graph is taken, the scenarios that inform policy decisions and form the basis for Paris Agreement voluntary pledges hide their continued commitment to high carbon emissions behind a large-scale deployment of so-called negative emissions technologies. Although negative emissions technologies are far from maturity and might have serious limitations to scale, we seem to be bound to their development and scaling. So it's a form of magical thinking that is implied in decarbonization policy under Paris Agreement, or at least so Kevin Anderson and Glenn Peters. Yet the effects of runaway climate change might increasingly shift the focus of, so the effects of runaway climate change that we are already feeling might increasingly shift the focus of climate policy from the energy transition toward technological fixes. Technological fixes are attempts to resolve the difficulties of social action by engineering solutions. That's the standard definition of what technological fixes are. According to the 2006 Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change, more dramatic climate change effects might cause annual losses of up to 20% of the global GDP. Yet the mitigation effort in the present should under no circumstance hurt the economic growth and competitive position of economies in the world capitalist system. It's an impasse, and so the technological fixes are called onto stage. As the climate action becomes more urgent and the inadequacy of current mitigation becomes more apparent, the climate engineering proposals are increasingly becoming the talk of the day. Climate engineering are intentional, so as definitions go, climate engineering are technological manipulations of the environment aiming to lower the atmospheric temperature and thus delay or neutralize some of the effects of climate change. Climate engineering schemes fall into two principal categories: solar radiation management and carbon dioxide removal. So a word about solar radiation management, which is more important here. Solar radiation management lowers the atmospheric temperature by reducing the energy flux entering from space into the Earth's atmosphere. This can be achieved by reflecting more radiation back into space before it enters the atmosphere. So that's the idea of solar radiation management. Three principal ways under consideration to achieve this are to stimulate the effect of volcanic eruptions by injecting sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere. This idea, so the whole idea about solar radiation management comes from the observed effect of the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in 1991, where the sulfur injected into the atmosphere by volcanic eruption has reduced direct sunlight by 21%, increased diffuse sunlight by 20%, and reduced total sunlight by 2.5%. Globally, this reduction of energy flux led to global cooling of about 0.5 degrees centigrade. So that one eruption caused cooling in a matter of a year or two by 0.5 degrees centigrade. No? This is what sets the imaginary here. So second method or scheme is to increase the cloud albedo, so the whiteness of clouds, either by seeding clouds or whitening the existing clouds through spraying of seawater into the atmosphere. And third is to increase the reflective capacity by placing either reflective particles into the atmosphere or reflective surfaces into the orbit. Carbon dioxide removal is a different set of schemes, no? And its primary aim is to capture the carbon dioxide that is already in the atmosphere or the one being created in the combustion process. As we generate energy, we create emissions. So you try to capture those emissions as you generate energy, thus lowering the existing atmospheric CO2 concentrations that are trapping heat, or future CO2 concentrations that are trapping heat in the atmosphere. There are four principal ways under consideration. First, to capture the atmospheric CO2 by conservation, replanting, and expansion of forests, so-called deforestation. Second, to capture the atmospheric CO2 by technological devices and sequester it either underground or into rock formations. These are so-called carbon capture and sequestration technologies. Third, to increase the capacity of oceans as primary CO2 sinks by fertilizing ocean phytoplankton with iron in order to increase its photosynthetic activity that binds CO2. And lastly, to increase the land-based carbon sinks, either by biochar production or permaculture methods of tending the land. At the current level of technological development, carbon dioxide removal schemes can capture only a small fraction of the cumulative atmospheric emissions. They can't do much at the present moment on the scale of emissions that we got. The exception to that is afforestation, particularly if combined with growing biomass for energy generation and with carbon capture and sequestration in that process of energy generation. Those are primary negative emissions technologies under consideration and worked into the scenarios under the Paris Agreement. However, large-scale afforestation, in order to help keep temperature in these scenarios, under 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, would require an enormous increase in land use for biomass production, around 0.5 million hectares compared to 1.6 million hectares that are presently used for agricultural production. Land transformation required would have serious trade-offs in diminished availability of land for food production, destruction of ecosystems and reduction of biodiversity, and potential carbon leakage due to technological implications of such schemes. Unlike carbon dioxide removal, it is the solar radiation management schemes that seem technologically more feasible. Yet there are reasons of risk and justice that make them more dubious. The whole debate around solar radiation management gained sort of traction after the sort of prominent climatologist Paul Crutzen, the person who popularized the notion Anthropocene, sort of broke the taboo in 2016, suggesting that in the face of the gargantuan challenge of mitigation, aerosols injections might become necessary. Spraying aerosols and seawater into the atmosphere by using aviation or balloons or what have you is also technologically and economically most feasible method to reducing the global warming. So I'll now discuss a little bit implications for justice. This is environmental justice track, so this, in a way, is the purpose of explaining what these technologies are and looking at the implications, particularly at the dubiousness of solar radiation management schemes. These climate engineering schemes can be implemented with little prior technological development and low carbon cost. So that makes them attractive. No? Like, we can easily lower temperatures in a matter of a year or two, slowing down on entirely stopping the sea ice melt and sea level rise, and thus potentially prevent the arguably largest human risks from climate change. They could be applied judiciously, so with moderation, to allow time to transition to low carbon trajectories and develop better technologies of carbon capture. So we capture CO2 that exists in the atmosphere while we keep sort of the temperature down. That makes them really attractive. However, their application could have various adverse effects. Alan Robock's extensive list from 2008 includes, among others, the following. Sulfate aerosols would have negative effects on regional climates. If sprayed in the tropics, they would cause winter warming in the northern hemisphere, and worse, if sprayed in the higher latitudes, they would weaken African and Asian monsoon patterns, causing potentially drought and, in a way, famine for billions. Second, higher diffuse solar radiation and lower direct solar radiation, which is the effect of basically whitening and less direct sunlight coming in, would reduce photosynthetic activity of plants, resulting in lower crop yields. Recently, there was a study which confirmed that. It confirmed that basically solar radiation management would substantially lower food or crop yields across the world, and hence would have negative impact on stability of human societies. They would also exponentially reduce the potential of solar energy installations, making some mitigation efforts less effective. Continued use of carbon-emitting fossil fuels would continue or would push on the acidification of oceans. So we would still continue to use fossil fuels while we keep temperatures down, and that will cause oceans to absorb more CO2, making them more acidic, which causes, for instance, bleaching of coral reefs or die-off of various organisms. Once initiated, such schemes would be, there would be no going back in the case of unforeseen consequences. These technologies haven't been tested enough for various reasons. Also that these technologies have sort of roots in military uses, and in a way, experimentation is not allowed. At least there were some attempts of rogue experimentation, but okay. So there would be no going back in case of unforeseen consequences, and spraying would have to continue for as long as the atmospheric emissions concentration is not lowered. Otherwise, if stopped, the temperature would quickly rise. So if we don't take out CO2, just keep the temperature down, once we stop keeping the temperature down, the temperature would suddenly rise very quickly. And sixth, implementation would potentially place the security of humanity into the hand of private corporations or one-sided action of some governments. So, this is a graph taken from a study that was published this summer by Will Stephan, Johan Rockström, and sort of a brigade of most famous climatologists out there, saying that we are approaching Hothouse Earth. and that basically if we don't act immediately to cut down on carbon emissions, we might be approaching a point of no return where Earth might enter a feedback cycle of constant heat up, basically making Earth as a planet more similar to Venus, basically inhabitable. So we are familiar with the argument that the countries considered more developed from a capitalist, technology-intensive perspective have historically benefited and are continuing to benefit from the more carbon-polluting development than the countries considered less developed and that are more vulnerable to climate change due to lack of resources for adaptation. From there, the Annex I countries of the Paris Agreement have the obligation to rapidly reduce their emissions, while letting the Annex II countries continue with emissions, some emissions, to catch up in development and be able to diminish the burdens of coping with climate change. Yet if we take that same comparative perspective of distribution of benefits and burdens or injustices, and if we acknowledge that efforts to reduce emissions are insufficient at the present moment and that we are heading towards dangerous climate change, and if we anticipate what Rockström and Stefan are saying, then some application of solar radiation management might become a moral obligation. So this is now the argument about moral justification. Let's look at this argument. From the distributive perspective of relative injustice, if harms from inadequate mitigation will be imposed on those who are already subject to climate injustice, solar radiation management technologies might be justified to lower the level of injustice if they are not capable for adaptation. So, though these technologies might not be good per se, in relative terms, they might diminish the injustice rather than letting business as usual do its work. Furthermore, these technologies might be justified if they are part of a hybrid set of policies that includes mitigation, adaptation, and climate engineering, which gives more time to everyone to research and develop strategies for mitigation and adaptation, allowing maybe even eventual phase out of those technologies. And this is justified, morally justified, provided that no one is worse off, or those who are worse off are justly compensated. So these are the arguments why these technologies might be justified after all, though they are not good in themselves per se. So it's a distributive justice comparative perspective that plays itself out in these arguments. And these are the arguments that people are making at present out there, and I think they are valid points. No? They are looking at, we are failing, we have this technology, it's a short fix, do we do it or don't we do it? Okay, so now I think they are morally impermissible for these reasons. While it was always sold as a plan B, in the face of inadequate mitigation, the climate engineering is increasingly considered nowadays a realistic option. No? Yet the problem is that such a proposition comes with a set of assumptions that contradict the internationally agreed obligations to undertake resolute climate action. So basically, what these arguments are doing, they're undercutting the justification of the framework already existing. First, by advocating amelioration of some risks from continued use of fossil fuels, these arguments practically provide justification to ignore other risks, such as ocean acidification, and thus indefinitely postpone rapid decarbonization. Second, these arguments ignore so-called global thermostat dilemma, which posits, how do we know what temperature, what do we want to go back to or set as the global correct temperature? Who will decide on the relative advantages and disadvantages of that. And how do we weigh those advantages and disadvantages? Third, if one country or a group of countries decides one-sidedly to use solar radiation management, the others would be forced into accepting it as a solution. There would be no going back. And thus, ultimately, fourthly, they preempt a potential decision of some societies to pursue a path of societal development that is different than quantitative, growth-oriented, intensely extractivist, exploitative, and dominative trajectory that marks capitalist mode of production. Questions of power and power asymmetries are thus central to this seeming moral weighing of arguments. So, before I conclude, a word needs to be said about the scope of such moral framing. Goods and harms in this perspective are primarily allocated based on human welfare, while largely ignoring human interconnectedness with nature. Climate engineering pushes a mechanistic view and instrumental use of nature that developed with the advent of capitalist modernity so it pushes this imaginary and this construction of nature to its planetary limits. Humans are struggling to limit their impact on the planet by paradoxically aspiring to control complex interlocking systems of that planet. The continued business as usual will push against other planetary boundaries that form, as Rockstrom has formulated, a safe operating zone for humanity. So we will have, as Jagoda has already mentioned, continued loss of biodiversity, acidification of oceans, land degradation, and so on and so forth. Yet that nature, though the attempt is to control its effects, is proving to be uncontrollable. As Carolyn Merchant, feminist Marxist, has argued, the concept of nature changes through history. It changes as the modes of production and the modes of social reproduction change. Mechanistic instrumental concept emerged against the earlier cohabitative notions of nature. Dynamic concept of nature as organism emerged with the advent of cybernetic management. Economically quantifiable concept of nature emerged from the penetration of marketization into ever new aspects of social and natural life. Now that nature is showing its teeth and threatening the capitalist growth, a new concept of nature, or a need for a new concept of nature, is emerging. It is against these previous concepts that we need to think of humans in nature as a relation of both precarity and care, one where we need to step back and step back quickly. So to conclude, as I said initially, my interest in all this is how do we transform technological systems, how do we steer technological change? Climate engineering is a technological fix to an ultimately political problem. How do we reorient our resources to deep decarbonization under terms of equitable redistribution? It's a hard question, and it doesn't seem that there is an easy solution, no? See Paris Agreement. It's an economically difficult, but probably and likely technically possible and feasible goal. Climate engineering is a fix that will select our future path dependency. We will enter a zone of uncertainty, forcing us to continue applying ever new technology fixes to fix regional and planetary instabilities of nature caused by previous ones. So, to finish off, I want to consider what makes it possible that disobedient forms of disruption scale and contest macrosocial structures. In a seemingly minor yet storied moment at the 2012, Naomi Klein writes about this, and this is in a way a rendition of her narrative. But so in a seemingly minor yet storied moment at the 2012 American Geographist Union Congress, the UCSD scientist Brad Werner gave a talk, Is Earth Fucked? Dynamical Futility of Global Environmental Management and Possibilities for Sustainability via Direct Action Activism, in which he presented his provisional agent-based model of a coupled human environmental system. His model looked at the diverging effects of different timescales of interaction between the social and the natural components in this coupled system, and what effects they had on the attempts to steer this coupled system to sustainable pathways. Werner explains that given the dominant culture, and that means the capitalist system, at fast time scales, the globalization and intensification of political and economic processes expectedly will continue to exploit environmental resources, ignoring the efforts of environmental management and resistances. At the intermediate time scales, so once we slow down a bit, the environmental management becomes subordinate to economic and political interests, while resistance can act only reactively to shape those interests. It is only at slow time scales that the resistance can change the dominant culture. While there is no proceedings or recordings of his talk, just the news reports and Klein's rendition of it, Werner, in his abstract, concludes, the transition from unstable dynamics to sustainability is sensitively dependent on the level of participation and repression of resistance. On his analysis, direct action and disruption matters, and it matters not only in stopping, slowing down, but also helping regulatory-led transition. This has been epitomized by the protests blocking, so this form of resistance and disruption, slowdown, has been epitomized by the protests blocking the Dakota Access Pipeline at the Standing Rock Indian Reservation. These direct actions, or direct actions such as these, have been effective both as a disruption and a delegitimation of the fossil-powered business as usual, highlighting the vulnerability of communities to the degradation of their immediate environment from both potential direct leakage of fossil fuels in the case of a pipeline and indirectly through the effects of runaway climate change. Yet, technological systems and social structures depend vitally on the continued availability of fossil fuels, so on the operation of these pipelines. So the protests at circulatory choke points, no matter how seemingly short-lived they seem, become the test of whether a society is committed to decarbonization and, more importantly, of rationality of total social means and ends of this system, opening political conflicts to both long and slow timescales of questioning where do we go with social development. By disrupting both the operation and the legitimation, this type of agency, done by relatively small groups, can jump scales. That's amazing. Now it can jump scales and create opportunities for transformation at the macro-social levels. And this requires, in theoretical terms, an adequate theory. One that acknowledges historically emerged social structures, so the real existing forms of state-based capitalism, and that has to allow for a multiplicity of interlocking strategies. There is no one strategy, I think. Nested in this real existing social world of states, institutions, and contesting detractors, so big oil. Vectors scale both vertically and horizontally, but they are operating in a medium which is strategically defined. So I think what's theoretically useful is looking at the theory that Bob Jessop has developed, a British theorist of state. And he conceives of the state and the economy as two interdependent and co-evolving autopoietic systems. Capitalist economy depends on the state to smooth out its contradictions, create markets, and better its competitive advantage in the global markets. State, in turn, depends on the economy to pursue broader social goals of welfare, population control, hegemony, thus effectively embedding economy in social relations. Institutions of the system reflect the relational power of social actors, but they can be contested and transformed by new imaginaries and projects. And these can then have strategic effects across different social subsystems. The state is here understood as a guarantor of consent by members of society to the dominative social relations, and this it can achieve through a partial representation of their interest and rearticulation of values of those various social groups. So state and society and economy are interlocked. They are sort of an integral state in Gramscian terms. Due to this plurality, alternative values, ideas and strategic propositions can penetrate deep into social systems. Dangerous climate change will be a crisis of hegemony for many capitalist states. And this provides room to instill into the current order a counter-hegemonic imaginary in defining different social and technological futures. Counter-hegemonic collective agency thus has a gamut of strategies on its disposal, from practice to discourse, from relations of reproduction to communicative power, from organizing struggles to articulating radical imaginaries. And obviously, in reality, it does go for all of them. We don't do one thing, we do many things. Even anarchists do many things. They live in this world and they are active part of this world, no matter that they criticize the state and justly criticize the state. Contestational collective agency makes its appearance in various subsystems in the system, from technoscience to education to politics. As capitalist state doesn't exhaust itself in relations to capitalist economy, collective agency that works outside of the nexus of the state and the economy can effectively place the business as usual of fossil capitalism in radical doubt and serve as a vector for radical claims within that strategic relational nexus. Given that it can make the unconditional demands for an urgent and radical divestment from fossil fuels and a societal transition, and that it can directly block the forces and actions that are undermining the decarbonization, it can act transformatively both at the level of hegemonic technopolitical values and at the level of operation of existing technological base. It can stop fossil fuel technologies. This vector of collective agency can thus scale horizontally to mobilize other social movements, trade unions say, and expert communities pursuing uneasy and difficult alliances, such as that with trade unions, to join the common struggles. And it can scale vertically to force the state and economic actors back into the trajectory of transition. It's a confrontational form of agency, but only by means of confrontation can the hegemonic common sense that cements the status quo be unsettled, and by means of confrontation will alternative technological designs be made plausible, paving the way for a different, more sustainable and just socio-ecological relation. Given that technology is hardwired social code, that there is a lot of habits, legal regulations, and social consensus set in technology, and that technologies are central to social metabolism, collective struggles cannot avoid technologies as a terrain of contestation. All work of affirmation, of building a different world, has to start with the work of negation, tearing down the existing world. Okay, so this is I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Tomislav. We needed approximately 10 minutes to hotel, but that means that we have still some 15-20 minutes for debate and questions, so comments.
Thank you, that was very nice. I just have two comments and one question. What you mentioned before on how technology is used in mitigation strategies, I think as of lately it's been also used as adaptation strategy. For example, lately we can hear how, for example, they develop these mechanisms where you can drink water which is polluted by buying some kind of technology devices. So it also became a part of adaptation strategy, which is kind of horrifying. And I just wanted to make a comment on what you mentioned, how distributive justice judgments are used as a form of moral justification. I think it's unfortunate, but I completely agree with that. However, the procedural justice aspect, which is actually the basis for distribution justice to be available, is often not considered. So I completely agree with that on you. And my question is actually, where do you draw the line on technologies that we could use in future, and what alternative technological designs do you think are, sustainable or, yeah?
So first to adaptation. Obviously, adaptation is also technologically invested, and imaginaries of adaptation are technologically invested. For instance, the most common discussed type of adaptation to sea rise is building dams, which are highly technologically complex systems, and I think that a lot of effort will go into those depending on the relative level of sea rise. But I didn't talk so much about the adaptation strategies from the technological point of view. I think adaptation has many more factors, and ultimately it's socioeconomic factors or trajectory of social development that is important both for mitigation and adaptation, because mitigation is at the center of the discussion around climate engineering. It's the failure of that, or inadequacy of that strategy to work its magic in the short time that we have before we are approaching dangerous or runaway climate change, and that this basically spurs the legitimation to consider climate engineering, which maybe 10, 15 years ago wouldn't be the case, and I think this will become more and more focus of research, and more there will be push to start experiment with those, because we are locked into the developmental path of growth-oriented capitalism. You can't decarbonize at a cost to growth of national economies, and then this is sort of a dynamic process, and the question is, how much time you've got, and what will be the effect of delayed decarbonization, which is delayed. Václav Smil, Canadian, he's environmentalist, and he studies basically energy systems, makes this claim that we'll probably see the domination of fossil fuels well into the second part of the 20th century, that renewables will not become, there won't be a next energy transition for a while, and that it might require us to consider whether we degrow. So that was what I think about adaptation. Adaptation is sort of a thing that is paid little attention to is connected with mitigation. Say, look at energy poverty now. Increasing energy efficiency of homes is the best way to mitigate. Around 25% of total primary energy supply in Croatia goes toward homes and they are interlocking, they're not separate things. Second thing was, sorry, I forgot, procedural justice.
Using distributive justice judgments as a kind of moral justification as opposed to procedural justice.
Yeah, obviously, no, procedural justice here has a lot to do with the intergovernmental framework. And then with climate engineering solutions, there is legacy of climate manipulation or weather manipulation serving as a weapon. And then there is the problem that whoever starts first basically decides upon the future for the rest. And that's really a hard decision to take. I mean, obviously with the Paris Agreement, similar decision was taken. No, there are implications there that speak to that. No, but and I guess any solution that will be global will have these problems. So they have to be again weighted relatively and how they can be pulled off. And then third was
on alternative technological.
Alternative technologies. So I think that technologies in that sense cannot be just easily projected. What do we want? No, we have to create social conditions under which technologies emerged, which are adequate to those conditions. And this also needs to include both people who are technologists and people who are users. In the background of this presentation is a critical theory of technology that was devised by Andrew Feinberg, an American scholar of technology, and sort of he works in the legacy of Frankfurt School critical theory, and he says that neither technical efficiency nor social functionality are selecting successful technologies. It's a social process at the end of which we have decision to take up this or that technology, or that this or that technology becomes dominant. And then we have to look at this process as a social process that includes plurality of actors, and we have to work with that. So that being said, I think that more democratic technologies that can be more distributed, decentralized, where in that sense, from the point of view of procedural justice, there is greater space for decision is better than the centralized technologies. But obviously that does not work at all scales. No, we have scale, and last time here I was warning against fetishizing decentralized technologies. If we are living in a world which is deeply built around centralized infrastructures. So if we drop centralized infrastructures, we'll have at least the problem of infrastructure rot. So we'll have to deal with that. So you will have to do the work of maintenance of that technological world that you just wanted to abandon. No, just leave ships to sort of be eaten by rust in the sea and see what happens. No, and think of the entire fleet. And so you have to take care of these things, and these things then lock you in again into some form of intensity. No? And so I think these are the problems. And what my views are of how do we do quick decarbonization, I think that we first need to invest at a dynamic that does not sustain sort of GDP economic growth, but that there needs to be a lot of social wealth taken to this task. And that might allow for a lot of room to see how various solutions work, be able to test solutions, be able to take on risks of failing solutions. And for this, I think we need sort of agency at a mesoscale or macro scale to be able to do this. No? I'm not fully on board with Marina Mazzucato, but somewhere along the lines of the state that drives technological development and is able to take on the cost and the risk of large things failing is an important element in all this, and it is up to us to build this. No, it's not that the state is there. We are part of the state. Our imaginary is part of the state and is projected back at us. So this is the implication of Gramscian notion of organic state. No, it's not separate. It's not out there. It's here, and this we need to work with. So this would be an answer. And then I guess we could choose some selection of technologies, but I'm not sure. I don't have the authority to say this is the perfect mix. No, I can say, it's great to have energy cooperatives, but the problem is, again, time, scale, is it feasible, is it not? Like if you want roof photovoltaics, there isn't enough roof space to complement the current energy needs. So there is many considerations. I would say there are some serious, deep things that we should consider, that is consuming less, and particularly consuming less meat, using that land for feeding people, maybe growing woods, or just not doing anything. That would already help a lot. And so there are various things that we can do and that could help the transition, but there is no one solution.
Just to come to the question of the technological fix. I mean, I very much like your proposal for, let's say, maybe, I don't know how you say, would it be technological determinism or technological anarchism? Okay, but let's say drop this out of the thing. What would you say if, let's say, if you would say that the utopian imagination or imaginary of a technological fix within the 20th century, this was the formula that communism equals Soviets, so special form of social engagement plus electricity, which was the Russian or the Soviet at least the name for this technological fix. But it happens when, let's say, just a month or 2 weeks ago, we have again, talking about rhetorics, and also with what you ended your talk about the proposal for counter-narratives or counter-hegemonic narratives. Taking this, let's say 2 weeks ago, we have a special case of enterprise which is named after the most utopian, let's say, technological fix of the 20th century, and this is Tesla. And the, let's say, idea of the infinite possibility of production of clean and also democratic production of clean energy. We have an enterprise which is called Tesla, so we have a metaphor of this. We have a Californian ideology in all the senses of Silicon Valley technology embodied in Elon Musk, who asks, or at least he tweets, of course, he tweets that Saudi Arabian money will back up his enterprise, not just, of course, the car production, but all the other fixes he at least imagines us to be able to do within the next decades, whatever. So let's say that unlike the Soviets plus electrification, which would equal communism, now we have something which is, let's say, Tesla, let's say, as a promise or rhetorics of this technological fix we're talking about. Then we have a most horrific, I guess, parochial fundamentalist state would be Saudi Arabian, which is built on the extraction of fossil energy, and then we have plus the imagination of some technological, let's say, DIY Californian lifestyle, whatever. So I mean, I would say how you would how would you embed this kind of a narrative, which is there, and which, again, also in a sense of a narrative, this narrative fuels not just stock markets, but all our minds, all our imagination, if you think of it, with the proposal. I mean, you started in a way modestly with the Dakota protest. And if you compare it, I mean, would you compare it? I mean, let's say this kind of a fueling discourse, someone like Elon Musk, in a way, tries to construct.
Well, Elon Musk is, as his statements go, sort of inconsistent figure, so it's hard to say anything about Elon Musk based on his acts. No, like it doesn't provide any basis for analysis. But I would say that the problem with technological development is, so the cycles of technological development are connected with the cycles of financial investment, no? Under capitalist development. So in a way, capitalist accumulation depends on the process of competition. Competition is based on the productivity of individual companies operating in that space. In order to increase productivity, they can either extend working hours or they can bring in better technologies. No? Once there is a new technology out there, financial capital will go toward it in order to capture productivity gains over the competition that will be achieved. It can be also a new sphere of accumulation. No? So this is sort of one-on-one how it works. So there is no surprise that financial capital is running toward who's promising to be the first sort of to capture electronic vehicle and infrastructure for electric vehicle and infrastructure for electric vehicle terrain. No, there is nothing contradictory in that, and it is likely that we might transition at some point. It is likely that solar energy will be cheaper than oil, and thus it is likely that markets will lead to it that Saudi Arabia might end up in problems. So I don't see anything irrational on their behalf that they are staking their help me out, staking their future on betting on alternative proposals. But that doesn't mean that those proposals will succeed. If Musk's acts are anything to judge by, electric car might fail because of Musk, no? Because of simply he being such an egomaniac who puts himself at the front of technological development process and sort of builds this ridiculous imaginary that it's individual inventors, people who can read everything, who know everything about everything, that they are the ones who are transitioning us into a different technological systems. It's not the case. No, he will be gobbled up by long-standing car manufacturers. It's not, again, it's not that segment of development that is IT. And I think this is the problem, no, with Elon Musk. A lot of his contradictions could be explained because he thinks, it's like developing software. You have top programmer who can really do much, much more than many people in the process of coding, and hence can make advances at the level of abstraction which others can't. And this is obviously not how deeply material, energy-intensive systems work. They work mostly by slow advances, and disruptions are not that easy, and also social stability depends on those systems. Whereas like, if a piece of software doesn't work, even if like in these in this day and age when we are dependent on certain platforms, we would still carry on and probably not be sort of threatened to, there would be no threat to our livelihood, sustained livelihood from these systems failing. No, but I don't know, this is how I would unpack that problem. There is a level of utopianism, but that level of utopianism is just ignoring that there are limits. Those limits to the planetary system are flexible, but are not infinite. If we transcend the planetary system, so if we go into space, yeah, that changes, but the time horizon of that, by that point we are all cooked. So I don't know, this just doesn't seem any sort of, that can't be basically rooted in any sort of realist appreciation of the reality around us. So that form of utopia is then just like romanticism of technology.
I'll be quick as well. In the last part of the talk around the counter-hegemonies and the social movement, I missed a little bit a description of how to deal with the disciplinary repressive aspect of the state. Because, I suppose just to give a little colour to that, it seems to me there's a shift from a democratic state, within democratic states here, not within non-democratic states, loosely called, that within those democratic states there was an attempt to build a sort of broad, or manufacture a broad consensus in which different groups were included within that consensus, not adequately necessarily, but included. And we're moving towards a system where that manufacturing consent is about exclusion, as much as it is about inclusion. And the word terrorist, of course, is one method to do that. So what are the tools that can be done in order to manage the shift of the state from manufacturing a broad consensus to basically producing a polarized situation in which one part of society is excluded from that consensus within the idea of the counter-hegemonic narratives, or are they in danger of simply being repressed out of existence?
You might want to take that with mine because it follows on, I think. I mean, it was great, and I like the counter-hegemonic bit, but there's a kind of other scenario which is a kind of spatialized, regionalized or zonalized scenario. You mentioned the under-experimentation. So one could imagine a phase in which the powerful experiment on the powerless and then expropriate the positive results from that experimentation to build kind of gated, climate-adapted communities which are exclusionary. I mean, one even almost sees that in parts of China now.
So this is a big and important question. It's big and important and immediate question because UNHRC predicts 250 million climate refugees by mid-century. No? And it would require me to think and give another talk to address this. But I think that the problem of climate denial, refugee crisis, nativism, and all that is highly connected, and we need to think through this. No? Obviously, the problem of global solidarity needs to be rearticulated with the acknowledgement of the real existing institutions and the problems that are there. What I provided is just a model, and maybe it's an incomplete model because it thinks how to disrupt that model or how to work through that model of agency, and not necessarily how to change the aspects of that model of agency. So in a bit, I admit to being a bit too theoretically idealistic in taking on this. I don't know, we need to build a new common sense. Where do we start? When I was writing recently a bit of coursework for my PhD, and it was dealing with energy systems here in the region, I thought like, we should also acknowledge that we are the climate losers, no? And the question is like, okay, what does it mean to lose from climate? No, who says that that's losing? Forms of adaptation are specific, and we need to fight for our forms of adaptation, no? And we need to fight for forms of adaptation of other people just as it's ours. So that would be sort of ex negativo, how to think internationalism in this context. But I don't know, I'll think about it and report back to Man U fans later.
Okay. Thank you. This is the closing of this first part of this model, and we will continue tomorrow.
Thanks, guys.